Well, okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Winston C. Thompson. I'm an associate professor of educational studies and philosophy by courtesy here at Ohio State. I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values. And it's through that work that I'm a member of it's through that work that I'm coordinating this year's COMPAS program. Now, COMPAS, or Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, is one of the central event series of the center. It brings together a range of thoughtful voices to focus our collective attention on important matters of public concern. And this year's theme, Education in Our Democracy, has provided ample opportunities to consider the past, the present, and the future of our society through the prism of education as a oftentimes contested pathway to participation in that abiding project. So today's colloquium, Are Trust and Safety Possible When We Learn Online, focuses our attention on a context in which we are increasingly educated or possibly miseducated about matters central to our democracy. Of course, across the world, many citizens get their news and their views from social media and other online venues. As such, the internet has become an undeniably significant context for civic education and engagement. But how should our democracy respond to the unique challenges and opportunities of developing civic perspectives within this medium? Should individual citizens be expected to properly vet the information that influences their votes? What protections are reasonable when we're informally learning from one another online? Today, we're joined by two exciting speakers who will be engaging these and related matters as we ask, are trust and safety possible when we learn online? Now, of course, before I introduce them, I'd like to say a few words about our format for this event today. So we'll first hear from each of our speakers, but after hearing from them, we're going to transition into something of a conversation between them, which I'll moderate, on the themes of their work and their perspectives as related to today's focus. And after this, we'll be in a position to learn online from you, our guests. We'll be transitioning to your questions. And so at any point throughout today's event, I want to encourage you to use the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. It should be located down at the bottom of your screens. Clicking into it will allow you to type in your questions for us. And of course, please don't wait to submit your questions in the same way that you might hold on to your questions during an in-person session in sort of in the same physical space. Instead, please know that we'll be queuing your questions throughout the event, and we look forward to the good ideas that will emerge from you, our virtual audience. And so, without further delay, please now allow me to introduce our speakers. Firstly, Nina Jankowicz is an internationally recognized expert on disinformation and democratization. Her debut book, How to Lose the Information Wars, was named a New Statesman 2020 Book of the Year, and the New Yorker called it a persuasive new book on disinformation as a geopolitical strategy. And her second book, How to Be a Woman Online, is an examination of online abuse and disinformation and offers tips for fighting back. This book was deemed essential reading by Publishers Weekly. Nina is currently the vice president of the UK-based Center for Information Resilience, which is a social enterprise focused on countering disinformation. Her expertise spans the public, the private, and the academic sectors. She's advised governments, international organizations, and tech companies, and she's testified before the US Congress, the UK Parliament, and the European Parliament. She's also led accessible, actionable research about the effects of disinformation on women, minorities, democratic activists, and on freedom of expression around the world. In 2022, Nina was appointed to lead the Disinformation Governance Board, which was an intra-agency best practices and coordination entity at the Department of Homeland Security. And this was a position from which she resigned after a sustained disinformation campaign caused the Biden administration to step back from the project. Some of her past affiliations have included the Wilson Center, the Keenan Institute, and the Science and Technology Innovation Program. Nina has advised the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry on disinformation and strategic communications and has managed democracy assistance programs in Eastern Europe. Nina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Winston.
Also on today's panel is Nicolas C. Burbules. Nick Burbules is the Edward William and Jane Marr Gutzell Professor in the Department of Educational Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His primary research areas are in philosophy of education, doing work on teaching through dialogue, as well as work on technology and education. Amid his multiple interests, which span the fields of philosophy and education, his current work on technology emphasizes the topic of ubiquitous learning, the study of new models of anywhere, anytime teaching, and the learning that arises from the proliferation of mobile technologies and our increasingly connected world. He's authored or edited 16 books. I'm not going to show all of the books here this morning, and over 200 journal articles and book chapters, a significant number of which have been translated into other languages. And he's currently the education director for the National Center on Professional and Research Ethics, located there at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I will sort of very quickly flag two of the books, one of which, many of his works have been co-authored, which I think speaks to dialogue and sort of work with others. I will just sort of point to his co-authored book, Feminism and Educational Research, while also drawing attention to his book here on the risks and promises of information technologies for education, themes of which I expect we might explore a bit today. Nick, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Of course. And so now, without further ado, I think we'll, as I've mentioned previously, we'll hear from each of our panelists with some opening remarks about how we might begin thinking of some of the themes of our ongoing conversation today. We'll first hear from Nina, then we'll hear from Nick, and then we'll have, as I mentioned previously, a bit of a conversation all together. Nina.
Thank you, Winston. It's great to be with you today and your virtual audience. I really appreciate the invitation. So I've been giving a version of this talk now for almost 4 years, prior to when my first book came out, and then it's evolved over time. And it's interesting because, especially with the pandemic, now it kind of feels like a blast from the past. You know, we have lived with this idea of disinformation, or as many people call it, fake news, although I don't really like that term, because actually what we see with disinformation is that the most effective disinformation is grounded in people's real grievances, authentic grievances. There's nothing fake about it. So much of this has stayed the same over the past 7 or 8 years, as long as I've been researching and writing about disinformation. And that's quite arresting to me, you know, the fact that we have understood this problem and recognized this problem from both the government side and academic side for so long, and yet we're still having many of the same conversations. But I'm happy to be here today to be having a conversation about this question of how education can really grapple with these problems. And it's something I try to do as an adjunct professor at Syracuse's Maxwell School with my graduate students, and something that I think, especially with the dawn of ChatGPT, we're going to be talking about for a long time. But today I'm gonna focus on how we can look at information literacy and why it's an antidote. I think not a panacea, but part of the solution for the problem of disinformation. And to do this, I need to kind of rewind 6 or 7 years back to when I was first living and working in Ukraine during the 2016 election and the lead up to the election of Donald Trump as president, when the United States was first grappling for the first time with this idea of fake news or disinformation. For so long, our partners and allies in Europe had been telling us, you have to take a look at what Russia is doing. Russia is using the internet in order to sow distrust, to sow dismay, to sow these false stories in order to burnish its international image and create discontent among populations it wanted to control. Countries like Estonia, Ukraine, Poland were all telling the United States and its allies this for many, many years. And it took the problem coming home to roost for us to really recognize it. And so I watched the 2016 election from Kyiv while I was advising the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. And it became clear to me that as everyone kind of grew more and more concerned about the issue, that we were overlooking some of the most important long-term solutions for the problem. So again, I was sitting in Ukraine, which at that point had been at war with Russia, the kind of early incarnation of the war that we're seeing today, since 2014. So it was 2 or 3 years into that war. And that was a war that was not only on the kinetic front, it was also on the informational front. Many of the tactics that Russia had used in the 2016 election in the US were first tested on the Ukrainian population, from everything from the Internet Research Agency, that infamous troll factory in St. Petersburg, to all sorts of more, nefarious advertising techniques and things like that. And Ukraine very quickly was learning that it couldn't do the job of protecting its population from these malign influence campaigns if it was just about removing content from the internet. And in fact, that's quite anti-democratic. We wouldn't condone the removal of content in any democracy. And so what Ukraine started to invest in at that point was media and information literacy. Through programs that were funded by the UK government, the US government, and others, the Ukrainian government started to train librarians, which I think is a really interesting approach, training librarians to do information literacy training. And what I love about this isn't just that, librarians are a trusted source of information in any society, but they're also very localized, right? Often we see governments doing, your sort of public service announcements, make sure you are checking the information that you're consuming, right? But who's going to buy into that? If you have a deep-seated distrust of your government already, you're going to look askance at a PSA coming from your government saying, make sure you're doing your due diligence online, right? But what Ukraine did was train these librarians who were from not big cities, not Kyiv, not Kharkiv, not Lviv. They were from local libraries who then went out and trained other librarians, other important people in the community on information literacy, who then went out and trained their fellow citizens, right? And this was a really successful project. It was implemented by IREX, the International Research and Exchanges Board, and they've got some really interesting pre and post survey results from the program that show that it actually works. I hear a lot of people saying all the time, we don't know if information literacy works. Sure we do, right? Like there's not only these short-term projects, but if you look at the education system writ large, it's the large information literacy project, right? We can't say that doesn't work in general. So this is where I first kind of latched onto this idea. And as I did my research across Central and Eastern Europe, it became clear to me that the governments that were ahead in building the resilience of their societies, that were ahead in recognizing and building a fulsome program to counter disinformation, didn't just invest in what I call playing whack-a-troll, removing content online. In fact, they recognized that was not the solution, that they needed a generational, citizens-based approach to countering disinformation. So in addition to Ukraine, in my book, I look at Estonia, which was one of the first countries to deal with Russian disinformation back in 2008. And if you don't know much about Estonia, it's a country that has a pretty deep rift between the ethnic Estonians and ethnic Russians who are in the country. Russia attempted to exploit this in 2008 through a series of protests, again, based in real grievances about Russians being disenfranchised in Estonia. And what the Estonian government recognized was that, again, they weren't able to just kind of say, this isn't a problem, you're being exploited by Russia, but they had to invest in the actual integration of Russian, ethnic Russian citizens in Estonia. And so they did this not only through, cultural and linguistic integration, but through education. They invested in projects like a Russian-speaking state TV channel, which to that point didn't exist before, making sure that there was good information for the ethnic Russians to access in their own language. They invested in higher education for Russian speakers, because to that point, Russian speakers either had to go abroad to receive their secondary education in Russia, or learn Estonian to the level that they could get into some very competitive Estonian universities. And so they created a Russian language version, Russian language campus of the Narva University, which is one of the most elite universities in Estonia. And this has led, again, we have the data, to more integration between the Russian and Estonian populations there. So again, another data point for not only information literacy, but actually looking at these citizen-based approaches, looking at what citizens are distrusting about their government and what makes them vulnerable to disinformation, and trying to address the root causes of that vulnerability. And then one final point, which I always like to tell, because I think it's a really interesting approach, again, that isn't just about classrooms. It's not just about K through 12. We often talk about media literacy in kind of this, young people approach, when it's really adults that we need to address, right? Voting age adults. In Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, there was an interesting approach created by a civil society organization where they identified performers of all stripes, musicians, comedians, actors, etc., who were interested in receiving some education about how disinformation and information operations work. And they brought them, they kind of did a workshop with them, brought them up to snuff about how the tools, tactics, and procedures of disinformation work, and then sent them to their hometowns. They were all from outside of the capital of Tbilisi. They sent them to their hometowns and gave them the funding to put on a show there. Their normal show, integrated with some of the new information which they created new material around. So envision like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, right? Doing a stand-up set, but integrating some really, well-sourced information that educates people, sort of infotainment. This is another great instance of localized approach, people who are trusted within local communities, but encapsulating information in a way that's entertaining to people. Because often what we see online, right, is people who are engaging with the most enraging content online, or the most exciting or funny content online, because that's what's prioritized in the algorithm. But we have to think about the way that people are consuming information these days and present them with good information in a way that's accessible and palatable to them. So again, it's a little concerning to me that, here we are almost a decade into this challenge with new technologies like ChatGPT, like, the advent of short form video like TikTok really taking over the internet. And we're still thinking about, disinformation, how it looked 6 or 7 years ago when Twitter and Facebook reigned supreme. And we really need to be thinking more proactively, more generationally. The fact that our government is not investing in these generational solutions from the top down, still to this day, is very concerning to me, because you better bet that our adversaries, whether we're talking about foreign adversaries or adversaries of democracy who exist domestically, they're thinking about it in that strategic way. And I do think education, I do think libraries, I do think community organizations that are education focused are a huge part of the solution. So I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to Nick's comments, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Nina, thank you so much. I've got, a couple pages here of comments and notes and things that I want to dig into further with you. But before we get there, the floor is now yours, Nick, as you give some of your opening thoughts on this theme and our subject for today.
Yeah, thank you, Winston. Thank you, Nina, for your comments. I've tried to plan my comments so that they're complementary to what you've talked about. And I even have some new thoughts based on what you just said. So I want to start with two quick distinctions. One is disinformation as a problem of external actors infiltrating a country with disinformation, whether it's Russia or China or whatever, versus domestic sources of disinformation. That's not an entirely either or distinction. Many external sources masquerade as internal sources. Many internal sources actively amplify disinformation from external sources. So I don't mean this as a strict either or distinction. And the other distinction is between what I'll call supply side solutions versus demand side solutions to the problem. And I agree with you, Nina, that strict government regulation or censorship or trying to block disinformation content, I can't think of any workable way to make a policy like that function that wouldn't have other repercussions in terms of censorship or even creating a certain kind of backlash. I also don't have much faith in these institutions voluntarily limiting themselves or restricting their content. I'll talk about that in just a second, but I laid out that distinction because my main focus will be on domestic or internal issues, not external issues, and on demand side solutions, not supply side solutions. It's not either or, they're both important, but I'm going to focus on the latter pair. So I want to start with a story that I think everybody is very familiar with now, which is the lawsuit between the Dominion voting machines and Fox and the release of emails. And one of the things that we learned, I think we all know now, is that the personalities on Fox, I won't call them news reporters, they're not news reporters, they're personalities, were quite blunt in speaking with each other off the record, that they knew that the information about election fraud, et cetera, was a complete set of lies and nonsense. They knew it was false, but they were petrified that if they didn't circulate this information to their viewers, they would lose audience share to Newsmax or OAN or other sources that were perfectly happy to promulgate that disinformation. And so because they were afraid of losing market share, they actively were putting things on the air that they knew were false and that they were telling one another were false. I think this is a real wake-up call for us about the disincentives of our market system and expecting any kind of real self-regulation or self-control by media organizations of any sort, whether television or social media, providers of information, when there is a lively, motivated audience for this disinformation. I won't belabor this point, I have more to say, but I'll just say this is one of the reasons why I think we have to look at the demand problem. As long as the demand is there, there's going to be suppliers of it. And so we have to think about what the sources of that demand are. I think another repercussion of this is another, I think, very familiar phenomena now, the bubbles, the echo chambers, the tribal communities that exist, the tribal communities of like-mindedness that exist within especially social media environments, where the community nature of sharing information with one another, but also this sense that we are a member of a particular group or movement, where the identity of the individual person is very much wrapped up with their association with these communities of like-mindedness, is another one of the dynamics that I think is driving the demand. And we have to look at those identity and community affiliation factors as part of the motivational structure for why some people seek out the disinformation that they do or exist within these disinformation bubbles where they actively don't want to be exposed to anything that's going to question or challenge their assumptions. And then the final factor I want to mention there is, again, what I think is becoming increasingly well-known, the empirical literature on cognitive bias, confirmation bias, what's sometimes called motivated reasoning, that all of us, to some extent, are characterized by these cognitive processes where we seek out information that supports and confirms our beliefs, and we find various strategies for discrediting, ignoring, or avoiding information that challenges it. And I think it's important and sobering to realize that this isn't just a problem of, the deplorables or, uneducated rural whites or whatever the they is, but that in fact the research suggests that we're all susceptible to this to one extent or another. So all of those factors, I think, are sobering when we start thinking about what it is possible to do on the demand side that would actually strengthen what you said quite rightly, Nina, what's often called information literacy or digital literacy. Sometimes it's called digital citizenship, fostering in people, especially young people, who maybe we still have a chance to turn around, unlike some of the adults who I fear many of them are just lost forever now, to try to cultivate this different kind of attitude towards information. So what I want to focus on in my comments now is what are some of the elements that I think would go into that kind of educational intervention to foster, again, what you called information literacy. So there's two pieces I want to talk about. One is the individual side. In here, I think the literature is fairly well established. I do a lot of work on critical thinking, teaching a class on it as we speak, working on a couple of papers on critical thinking. One element is clearly fostering in people the skills of critical thinking. How do we detect fallacious arguments? How do we evaluate the credibility of the sources of information? How do we exert more rigorous, critical, skeptical attitudes towards apparent facts or apparent information? Clearly, the skills of critical thinking are a crucial part of what we're needing to teach people. And I have to say that in much of the literature on critical thinking and much of the literature on information literacy, it stops at the level of these skills. The skills are crucial. They're a crucial element. But the literature on critical thinking always emphasizes another component, although different critical thinking theorists call it different things. Bob Ennis, my former colleague here at Illinois, talks about what he calls the critical spirit. Israel Scheffler at Harvard called it cognitive emotions. Scheffler's primary student, Harvey Siegel, calls them the dispositions of critical thinking. This other set of factors are not the skills of critical thinking, they're the attitudes, values, and motivations that make people want to enact critical thinking. And that's a different set of educational tasks. What Ennis and Siegel and Scheffler all say is teaching the skills without teaching these, what I'll call motivational elements, is empty. People have certain kinds of abstract cognitive capabilities, but they don't actually have the willingness or the persistence or the patience or the tolerance for conflict that actually goes into enacting them. And so I think while the first part is important, the dispositional elements are often underestimated, and particularly in the present context of what we're talking about, they're absolutely crucial. And I'm going to come back and say a little bit about those in just a second. The other educational task is what I'll call building critical communities. These critical capabilities are not simply a matter of educating individual actors with certain sets of skills and dispositions. It's also through education and, as Nina said, through libraries and other kinds of community organizations, including social media groups themselves, creating these critical communities where there's processes of collective self-correction, collective sharing of more legitimate, more valid information, and holding one another honest within this community by questioning and challenging one another's beliefs, so that it isn't simply seen as an individual attainment. So when we talk about these problems of things like cognitive bias or motivated reasoning, it's pretty clear to me that an individual solution isn't adequate. And so the community element, I think, is also a crucial part of that. Let me just say a couple things, and then I'll stop talking for now. We can come back and go through this in greater depth about this other set of critical capabilities, motivations, dispositions, the critical attitude, the critical spirit. What does that actually mean? A lot of the work I'm doing now is in the area of virtue ethics and virtue theory. And one way to think about these is as a set of epistemic virtues. values and attitudes that people have as part of their character and makeup that are educationally produced through schools, through other community organizations and groups, through families, through friendships. Going back to Aristotle, what does it say? It takes a village. Virtues are fostered by the communities within which people are brought up, or not, depending on the nature of those communities. And so the educational task, one of the educational tasks is not only look at these critical skills of information literacy, evaluating sources of information, determining or diagnosing fallacious reasoning, all really crucial. These other factors, and I want to talk about a few of them. One of them that's often talked about that isn't often seen as part of critical thinking is the virtue of open-mindedness. The idea of always being willing to consider the possibility that you are wrong and that the other side is right. This is really crucial, especially in the present context where we're living within these epistemic tribes or bubbles in which all people encounter is more and more information that confirms in their own mind that they and the people like them are right, and those other people are crazy. And while we sometimes tend to think of this, let's say academics, particularly as well, us versus them, we sometimes don't realize that the extent to which we fall into that, we're falling into exactly the same kind of epistemic tribal dynamics. And then in fact, the possibility that we are also wrong and that those people, the deplorables, are dupes or is exactly a symmetrical mirror of what they see in us. And the more we act in ways that act cognitively superior to them, the more that we insulate them from ever wanting to take us seriously because they feel the contempt. And so there's what's often called a backlash effect. When you go to certain people and groups and say, here's 3 pieces of evidence about why you're wrong, they don't perceive it as, oh, gee, I should go back and think about that. They perceive it as, you're an intellectual elite that has contempt for us. And the fact that you're criticizing and challenging us is a threat that simply gives us another reason to dismiss you. And so I think we have to be aware of the ways in which these, what I'm calling these epistemic tribal communities operate, and to be self-critical and self-aware that we sometimes ourselves, we, the good guys, are sometimes contributing to that dynamic. I think that's a point. So open-mindedness, what I'll just call simply here, the willingness to tolerate, to not only to tolerate, to seek out other points of view, and to consider the possibility that one might be wrong, I think is a crucial element of critical thinking. That is, I think you can see, it is a dispositional or motivational quality. It's a virtue, I would say, that also needs to be formed educationally. That is the motivational trigger that makes us want to be critical thinkers and makes us want to engage new and even sometimes challenging information that might be upsetting to our worldview and our assumptions. Having said that, one of the other sort of paradoxes here is that the communities that we find ourselves in, and I've already kind of touched on this point, the very same communities that we seek to sort of keep us honest, to share information amongst ourselves, to sort of subject one another's beliefs to various kinds of testing or questioning, can also be ways of reinforcing these, what I keep calling tribal dynamics. And so the very nature of a critical community is that it is both a way of exposing oneself to ideas within that community, but also potentially creating a buffer or a barrier towards engaging other communities. And so these communities have to be somewhat porous in how they interact with one another. They can't become themselves new kinds of insularity. And so there are some tensions, I don't want to call them paradoxes, but tensions built into this model, that some of the very things that we are trying to do to promote critical thinking, to promote information literacy, to promote these critical communities of self-exploration and sharing of information, can also be counterproductive when affiliation with the community gets wrapped up with issues of identity that make us resistant to and even intolerant of people with other points of view. I have more to say, but I think I'm going to stop at that point.
Nick, thank you so much. I mean, just as was the case after Nina's opening remarks, I'm just looking at the notes that I have here, and there's so much to dive into, to dig into, and to engage with. But I suspect before turning to all of the notes that I've taken and things that I want to ask questions about, I think it might be wise to start with a question that is actually a question about the context. So you both sort of talked about persons and how we might change persons, change communities, and so forth. And I suppose I might want to start us off by asking a question about you know, the resources, the information, the epistemic resources out there, and to ask about how we might think about these things on the internet. So you know, the internet is a setting that people visit often to get additional information, clarity on issues. And in traditional settings that people might visit, such as a university classroom, it might be clear who is responsible for ensuring the accuracy of the information that individuals receive, right? People used to pick up newspapers to get their information, and it was clear, I think, you know, who could rightfully be expected to uphold the standards of journalistic integrity, including truthfulness and other things. And so I guess my question here is, given the decentralized nature of the internet as a context in which people are getting their information, before we turn to that conversation about sort of changing persons, I'm just curious about whether there might exist some standards that we think ought to be created for all, or maybe most, or maybe only some online content. Who should be responsible for ensuring, who, if anyone, should be responsible for ensuring the accuracy of the information online? I mean, Nina, you earlier sort of made reference to the ways that, you know, folks wouldn't want to remove information from the internet, right? But is there not still a question about standards of truth in the information that's available to folks? Curious to have both of your responses.
Yeah, absolutely, Winston. I think this is one of the main issues that legislatures around the world are grappling with as they try to set standards for how these companies you know, we spend so much time on the platforms. They are the main conduits of information in our democracy now in this new media environment, how they're making decisions about content moderation. And it's not lost on me that the title of today's event, Trust and Safety, really comes from the kind of online marketplace, right? Trust and safety wasn't a profession or wasn't a concept that existed in so far as that phrase prior to, you know, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, creating these trust and safety professionals who dealt with the content moderation and policies of their platforms. The problem is that right now, all of these unelected individuals, sometimes who have absolutely no subject matter expertise in, let's say, you know, something that I focus a lot of my research on, how gender is employed in harassment and hate speech, or frankly, media literacy and education, right? They're kind of tech experts, but they're not necessarily experts in hate speech and harassment, what have you, violent extremism. And so what we're seeing is the really uneven deployment of content moderation standards, and frankly, a really opaque deployment of those content moderation standards. And something that a lot of experts in this area have been clamoring for, and that will happen in Europe, thanks to the DSA, the set of regulations, Digital Services Act, that will be coming into force in the coming years, is the transparency around the content moderation decisions that platforms are making. At least when we have that information, when we have the data about, you got this many reports, you took down this much content, some of it was related to you know, foreign interference, some of it was domestic extremism, some of it was just harassing content that, you know, goes against our terms of service, et cetera, et cetera. When we have that information, we'll be able to, I think, understand a little bit better who holds the power. But right now, it's all concentrated within those platforms. And I'm not suggesting that, any government have the power to say to a platform, you have to take down X, Y, and Z content that isn't manifestly illegal. But I think as consumers of information, we need to understand what decisions the platforms are making. And right now, not only do people not understand what decisions the platforms are making, they don't even understand the hundreds, if not thousands, of micro decisions that are being made by artificial intelligence to get that information into people's feeds to begin with. And so this is where it gets back to being an information literacy problem, right? So yeah, I don't think that, to get back to your question, Winston, that there should be any one entity making those decisions, but I think we need to have a broader conversation around about how those decisions are being made. And when there is transparency, then we can talk a little bit about oversight, because there are instances in which manifestly illegal content is being allowed to continue to exist on platform, and when marginalized communities are having their voices quashed because artificial intelligence is making those decisions and is responding to minorities, women, et cetera, in a way that is as we've seen with ChatGPT, again, to beat a dead horse here, is frankly biased against all of those communities. So I'll stop there for now. Lots to unpack.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nina. Nick, do you have anything that you'd like to add here?
Well, just two things quickly. One is I absolutely agree that helping people to understand, particularly social media, how it works, how the algorithm works, why certain kinds of content does get pushed to you, and creating greater transparency is, I think, one really crucial element of information literacy, that people understand how social media collect data from us, what they do with it, and how they use it to I guess I'll use the word even, shape and manipulate what is presented to us, is, I think, one element that might begin to make users on the demand side a little bit more skeptical or questioning about what they're seeing and why they're seeing it. And I think that is a useful tool. I think this is a whole other topic. I think that we work within universities. And I think that we see universities, those of us who work in universities, as one of the major bulwarks against disinformation. That universities are in the critical thinking business, and that we are, in many societies, in most societies, the primary providers of rigorous, vetted, curated, qualified, authoritative information and knowledge in any particular field. That's what universities were created to do. And so, I mean, having spent my career in one, I believe that universities are one of the last remaining places that creates a counterbalance to the world of disinformation. Having said that, and this is a whole other talk, I'm increasingly concerned about the ways in which, even within universities, we are increasingly seeing some of these very same dynamics. And that principles within universities, like academic freedom, liberal education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, values that we all hold in common within universities, are surprisingly, disturbingly, often the venues for the promulgation of disinformation, biased information within the institution itself. So even within a university, the guardrails or the protections against disinformation are not quite as rich, we're learning now, are not quite as robust as we like to believe they are. And again, it reinforces the ways in which we have to be self-critical and self-questioning about the ways that we are also susceptible to some of these same dynamics, which may be a sobering reminder that the solutions are going to be harder than just saying, well, if those people would just listen to us, we could correct them and disabuse them of their misconceptions. A lot of educators like to, and university academics like to think that way. I think the world's not that simple anymore. Unfortunately, I wish it were.
Yeah, so this is really productive, it's helpful. I mean, I'm reminded, as I'm listening to both of you, I'm reminded of the ways in which you're both identifying some of the troubles, with the creation of standards, or rather troubles with the creation and enforcement of particular standards, as biases, social identity-based biases might come forward, biases related to our particular areas of expertise. Nina, you talked about the ways in which, someone being quite advanced in their thinking about tech doesn't mean that they're progressive in their thinking about social issues. And so you really do see sort of a perfect storm, if you will, of influences creating a degraded epistemic and deliberative community. And so I suppose I want to just kind of shift then to talk about precisely that issue, as Nina, you began to invoke it, thinking about how it might be the case that the identities that we hold may be relevant for this conversation. So it's certainly the case that social identities create advantages and disadvantages for individuals across various contexts. But I want to invite both of you to say something more about how democracies might move towards promoting fairness and equity rather, online, ensuring, for example, that unjustly marginalized perspectives don't get drowned out in these developmental and deliberative spaces, either by groups that are antagonistic towards those identities sort of deliberately, or the algorithms themselves, which are just sort of engagement driven, right? How should we begin thinking about safety online for persons and perspectives when so much of this is driven by, as was earlier mentioned, right, algorithms that are serving other interests? I mean, I'm just sort of very quickly, I'll just mention that there was a paper that I was looking at last week in Nature about negativity driving online news consumption, right? So negative titles driving people towards news stories in ways that, again, cater to the fears that people have of some other who is unlike themselves. So again, my question here is about identities and how we might move forward to provide some spaces within which identities don't get lost in the algorithmic shuffle.
Well, I'll start, and I'll try not to go on too long, because as I mentioned before, this has been one of the things that my research has focused very much on over the past couple of years, and also something that I've dealt with a lot myself. I first became interested in the way that gender intersected with online activity, let's just call it that, when I was researching Russian disinformation, and I was interviewing women active in civil society in Central and Eastern Europe, and I kept coming across instances of politically active opposition forces, women who had been smeared ostensibly by the Kremlin in very misogynistic and gendered ways. And at the time, this was just in the aftermath of the 2016 election. So we were all talking a lot about the ways that Hillary Clinton had been portrayed by the US press, but very little about gender as a cleavage that foreign entities were employing in their work. And of course, we talk about gender in mainstream press coverage very frequently, but the way that this was all coming together as a foreign policy tactic and a national security issue was very interesting to me, and something that nobody was really talking about. And so I found these instances of women in Ukraine and Georgia, one who had a fake sex tape released of her that attempted to smear her, and luckily she was able to debunk that sex tape. There was another woman who had her face photoshopped onto naked women's bodies, and a nasty rumor spread about her, to the point that she was asked about it by a reporter from a European country at the UN when she went to speak there. And then I looked into the ways that women candidates for office in the 2020 election were attacked by gendered disinformation and online abuse. And what we found in that study, which was a mixed method study looking at both keyword-based searches of women across 6 social media platforms, as well as qualitative interviews and focus groups with targets of online abuse, was that women, particularly women who had intersectional identities, so women who were ethnically or sexually diverse, had much more difficult experience than their white female counterparts online. So as you add on these intersectional identities, and this is true for men too, we find that men who are, racially, ethnically diverse, sexually diverse, also encounter more abuse online than women get far and away more than that. Frankly, it's just this kind of almost insurmountable challenge. And in my own experience, what I've dealt with over the past year has been, it's everything from silly insults to rape and death threats and, doctored images of me that make me seem evil, or, are threats via images, or sexualized in some way. I mean, it's just the whole gamut of things. And frequently what I encounter when I'm talking about my research or my own personal experience is that, these are just mean words on the internet. These people are all bark, no bite. And there's a couple of things wrong with that, right? In an instance where or an environment where we see people frankly radicalized to violence because of the internet so frequently, it's hard when you're receiving those threats over and over and over again to discount them, right? Especially when you're doxxed, which is when your private information is released online, and that happens very, very frequently to women. It happened to me. It happened to many of the women that I interviewed in focus groups as well. But it's also, it's just exhausting. And the analogy that I frequently make, and I make in the opening of my second book, How to Be a Woman Online, is imagine if you were on your way to work or sitting in your office, right? And you were surrounded by a crowd of hundreds of people that was flinging insults or worse at you all day long for months on end. That is what online abuse is like. And when we see platforms discounting it, when we see governments discounting it, what that says is to these women or people of intersectional identities, it's that your voice isn't as important enough for us to take care of you and ensure that you have the same access to speech that your white cis male counterparts have. And so I did an interview last year when Elon Musk was first considering buying Twitter. It was right after my book came out. And I said something like, I shudder to think what Twitter and other social media platforms will be like if more free speech absolutists were to take over these platforms. And I stand by every word of that. Look what has happened to Twitter in the past several months since Elon Musk took over. I have seen certainly an increase in abuse. There have been, quantitative studies that have tracked that as well, despite what Elon Musk may say. And communities that have been built over years of people of intersectional identities have then fled the platform and struggled to reconstitute themselves in other spaces. So it's extremely frustrating to try to get recognition for these problems. And frankly, when you bring them to law enforcement, you are often looked at like you have 3 heads. It's like, lady, what am I going to do about this guy in New York that's abusing you online, right? Our law enforcement infrastructure is not up to snuff when it comes to cybercrime, when it comes to cyber harassment. And so I think we need to think about all of these things in a very different way. Things that are tolerated online that are not tolerated in the real world. We need to kind of bring those 2 ideas together. And how can we, change the reality for people of intersectional identities online? I think governments need to think about this much more strategically. I think platforms have a duty of care for their users. This is not just about, more speech is better speech, right? Because when certain entities are being given more speech, that means just very clearly that other people are self-censoring, and we need to create an environment where people feel free to express themselves, and there are consequences for the actions of of other folks. And that's where we get into back to that transparency discussion, like when I'm reporting something, where is it going? Who is responding to it? How many reports are getting responded to? And what's happening on the other end? Because if there were a consequence to these actions, people would not be so readily sending rape and death threats to people on the other end of the spectrum. All right, that was as short as I could do. A lot to unpack there, but really, I mean, we have a serious problem for democracy here. And I like to say that, you know, when Kamala Harris was taking the oath of office as our first female vice president, it was a beautiful moment. There was a lot to be proud of in that moment. But if you look at the replies to any single one of her posts online, you also see a lot of really disgusting stuff. And for every single one of those replies, there is a little girl somewhere, or frankly, a grown woman somewhere who might be thinking about getting involved in politics, speaking out online, and she sees what's happening to Vice President Harris, and she says, I'm not going to do that because it's not worth it for me and my family. And it's a calculation I've had to make myself several times as well.
Thank you so much, Nina. I mean, yeah, as you say, so much to unpack there, and just so much for us to sit with, to think through, and to analyze. Nick, did you have something you wanted to add on this?
Oh, sure, of course, I always do. Two brief things, and then a sort of a new point. Nina's comment about fake videos alerts me to the fact that, and she touched on this earlier too, one thing we don't know when we know it's coming, we don't know how we're going to deal with it, is the impact of AI on creating almost indetectably falsified photographs, videos, people actually speaking to the camera and saying certain kinds of things that are all deep fakes of one sort or another. We all know that Joe Biden announced his candidacy this morning. The RNC instantly released an ad that was an AI-generated ad about the dystopic future of what America will look like if Biden is elected. They clearly had this ad queued up and ready to go the second he announced. It's a pretty horrifying and terrifying ad about a nation crumbling and falling apart. It's AI, it's fake, it's an imaginary future that is predictably, almost comically dystopian in its vision of the future. This election coming up is going to be the most AI influenced ever. And I predict we're going to see a lot of ads that include fake videos, fake quotes, fake photographs. And this is a whole new area where I think some degree of regulation has to be put in place. Again, I'm not primarily focused on the supply side, but there has to be some mechanism to prevent this from happening. The other point I agree with Nina about, I can't say anything to add to her great comment, is that we are seeing that people from certain identity positions are disproportionately at risk in online environments, and that hate speech, harassment, doxing clearly disproportionately bears on members of certain groups and certain identity positions. She's experienced it herself. This is another area in which I think we do need to look at some kind of supply side standards or regulations. We can't have rampant hate speech and attacks like this online without some process of filtering or correction. I don't have a mechanism for how to do that, but this is not itself a disinformation problem. Well, it's a kind of disinformation, but it's special and it's distinct in that it's not just spreading conspiracy theories. It's attacking individual people and groups of people in increasingly ugly way. And I also share her concerns that principles that we share, like free speech, or in the academic university context, academic freedom, are increasingly being marshaled to defend comments about individuals and groups that would not be tolerable in other environments, but that are rampant in online environments. And we have to come to grips with that. I agree completely. The only other point I would add about identity, and I touched on this earlier, is that I'm also interested in identity, not in the sense of what we think of as sort of ethnic or racial or gender or LGBTQ identities. That's the way we often think about it. I think we also need to think about identity as a manifestation of these, what I've called earlier, these epistemic tribal communities, that increasingly we are what we believe. We are with those who believe the things that we believe. And that epistemic aspect of identity is crucial, I think. It's crucial, I think, to understanding how these cognitive biases actually operate at the sort of psychological level. That part of why people are unwilling to engage ideas or perspectives that challenge their beliefs is because that's overlaid with these powerful senses of identity and community membership that makes people feel justified in resisting or ignoring this, not only at an individual level, but because we know better, or the people I read and interact and communicate with on a daily basis confirm to me that I/we are right and they are wrong, which is a handy excuse for them not having to consider information or perspectives from other points of view. That way in which identity is wrapped, even some of those other elements of identity are also, whether you're white males or African-American females, that is also wrapped up with these belief systems and these communities of belief. And I think that's a dynamic that we also need to think about, especially, but not only in educational contexts, because I think it's part of what is underscoring this increasingly polarized and segmented epistemic world, where we identify ourselves partly in terms of who we agree with and who agrees with us. It's a natural human response, but it's potentially dangerous. And I think we're starting to see those dangers.
So thank you, Nick. And there's a lot of connection between what you've both said, and I want to kind of pull some of that out. But I also want to remind those who are listening in that the Q&A queue is populated. There are a number of good questions here that I'm going to turn to right now, but there's still time for you to put your own question in. So I want to encourage you, particularly if you're an undergraduate student, we want to make space for you here. So do feel invited to drop your question into the queue. So let me just sort of turn from some of what you've already said regarding, both of you have already said regarding the onslaught of, false images, AI generated text, image, video, etc. That does seem to be sort of, it feels wrong to say the next thing because it's happening now, it's today. But that does seem to be an area that we might want to explore further, particularly as a lot of the comments that we've had thus far in thinking about media literacy, as you I think mentioned, Nick, it's hard to know, it's hard to tell today, right? April of 2023. We can only imagine what April of 2024 is going to look like in terms of the sophistication of some of this stuff. Hard to know if media literacy is going to allow us to navigate this well. So one of the questions here is directed at Nina, but I think a question for both of you. Things change so fast, platforms shift rapidly, and theoretical models can be difficult for some persons to grasp. Do you think it's better to have an information literacy program built around principles, or so that they can be applied more broadly? Or do you think a practically based approach might be better, at least in the short term, for encountering the context that we do online?
Nick, do you want to take that one first? It seems in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. So I don't think I necessarily want to choose between a principle-based approach and a more practical approach. I think virtue ethics, one of the things that appeals to me about it is that it has elements of both. But I do think that, let's just take the example we're talking about now, which is AI generated content. There's no way for the individual user or recipient of this content to, on their own ability, filter or determine what's real and what's fake. There are ways, I understand, technically to determine that, but the individual user doesn't have access to those mechanisms. So somebody sends you a social media post with a quote of Donald Trump saying some idiotic thing. Not hard to imagine that. But in this particular case, Donald Trump didn't say that particular idiotic thing. It's a fake. Well, what do you do when it comes to you? It confirms your views about what I will assume is our views about Donald Trump. It's funny, maybe, it's outrageous. And as you said, outrage and negativity drives online traffic, and this thing will then be posted and shared to thousands and tens of thousands of other people. Where did it come from? Who created it? Why did they create it? It's going to be increasingly difficult for individual people to make those kinds of determinations. That's one reason why I think that these community processes are really crucial to how this works at the level of practice, of actually doing it. Because I will need to rely on other sources to tell me where this video came from. Or other sources to say, well, we know we looked at the video and it had these traces in it that tells us that it was falsely generated. But then, of course, I have to trust those sources to assume that they're telling me something credible. And there certainly will be areas of the internet where there'll be sources that are themselves reinforcing these fakes by confirming them as real. This is really convoluted. And I'll be honest with you, I'm very, very concerned about it, because a lot of our standard mechanisms that we teach in our critical thinking classes about evaluating the credibility of sources and where did it come from and how do we assess reliable information, they're not going to work in this environment. And here's an interesting thing. It's a kind of a Derridian thing. The very same criteria and principles that we use to detect things will be then used as mechanisms for creating new content, because the very same things we use to diagnose these falsehoods are actually an instruction manual on how to do them in ways that will avoid or resist those detections. I'm very concerned about this.
Yeah, thank you, Nick.
And that's actually happened already with QAnon. You know, a lot of people are like just asking questions, and media literacy is absolutely turned on its head by people who see a vast conspiracy everywhere. With images, you know, a couple of things. I think there's been some really interesting work actually done by Adobe, the software that actually, you know, creates some of the deepfakes, has, you know, led people to be able to create these really convincing deepfakes. And they've got something called the Content Authenticity Initiative, which brings together not only software manufacturers like Adobe, but photographers and digital content creators. Twitter used to be on it. I'm not sure if they are anymore, but, you know, newsrooms, et cetera, where they're looking to give content that we'll encounter online a digital provenance stamp. So you'll be able to, the idea is, unpack the edits that have been taken to create an image or to alter an image in a specific way in order to verify yourself as the consumer of that image or video what has been done. And the idea is that, like, anybody who has that stamp on it, and you can then go and kind of play around and see, okay, this is how they changed the lighting, this is how they, you know, altered the image in this way. That is an image that you can trust. That's an image that is created from real life, or if it's not created from real life, right, it will be noted there that it's been artificially generated. And anything that doesn't have that stamp on it will then be able to know, okay, this is somebody who hasn't been involved in this process and is for some reason hiding the provenance of the image. And I think that's pretty interesting. It does present some questions about, okay, well, the software manufacturer is the one who has the keys to this kingdom, but I think it's a good step forward. And the fact that we're thinking about it so early on in the development of this technology is it's pretty comforting to me, because it's not going to take us unawares. We've also been talking about, you know, the threat that deepfakes have posed for many years. And so I think there are a lot of smart people thinking about it, and I'm concerned, but I'm not as concerned because I think there's a general awareness and understanding of the problem more than there was about the general disinformation issue. What we do lack an awareness or recognition of is how deepfakes are often being used today. And that brings us back to the previous question about gender and marginalized communities. So something that most people don't know is that most of the deepfakes that exist today, like upwards of 95%, are actually non-consensual deepfake pornography of women. The models are trained on women's bodies. If you put a male body in there, it wouldn't be able to work, or it would be very unconvincing. But there are chat bots that can create very convincing nude images of women by just feeding it a couple of Facebook images of an ex-girlfriend or whatever, and you send that and it'll send back convincing nude images of that woman that you can then spread around and use to defame her. This has happened with videos and movies of women as well in places like India, where the awareness of this technology, as well as the misogyny that runs rampant there, has meant that it's had really disastrous consequences for women in public life. And I've been making the point for several years now that, we talk a lot about deepfakes and how one day we might see a deepfake nuclear threat that could have disastrous consequences. Yes, that's true. We could see similar, electoral disinformation in that vein, but there are real consequences for women all over the world today. And often in these national security oriented conversations that I'm in, we do not mention them. And that's going to be a real problem, because there will be a woman candidate for office. There will be, let's say, a female general or a public official, Secretary of State, who knows, that will be hit with one of these eventually. And I'm not sure we have a response plan for what happens when we do. And I certainly don't think that there are people around the world who wouldn't, gleefully watch something like that just because it's a deep fake. And that's really, really disturbing to me.
Well, let me just add one thing.
Please.
You know this better than I do. The problem with those deepfake nude photos is the damage isn't undone if you say, well, that's not really my body. That's a deepfake video. That's not something that is going to shield the woman from the damage that's done of the photo circulating. Whether it's deepfake, whether people even know it's fake or not, does not undo the damage that's being done there. And of course, for all sorts of reasons, this is a threat that's disproportionately bears on women and not men, certainly. And I'm sorry that you've had to suffer it too.
So in addition to what we've been discussing here as it relates to identity, and as we begin thinking about AI generated text, video, images, and so forth, I do want to get us back to our earlier comments regarding media literacy, critical thinking, etc. As there's a question here in the queue regarding the degree to which some of those approaches might be downplaying the ways in which social media technology exploits our psychology. So this question asker here, this is Henry Lara, says, that the internet is addictive. We've known this since the 1990s, right? Even a well-trained critical thinker may have trouble putting their device down. And we also know that some of the biggest conspiracy theorists on the internet, right, are well-educated folks. They hold PhDs, perhaps, probably not in the fields relevant to their conspiracy theorizing, right? But the question here seems to be asking us, if education seems to serve as something of a solution, maybe we've got some resilience in a particular area of expertise, but perhaps, right, we're just as vulnerable in other areas. And we might want to ask ourselves whether critical thinking is really the solution, whether media literacy is really the solution. And so I put the question to our panelists now.
I think those are really, really astute points. And I want to say, I don't think information literacy can be the only solution. It needs to be coupled with thinking about psychology, as the questioner mentioned. And that brings me back to two of Nick's points from earlier. Nick was talking about groups online and how they can be, useful in both countering and encountering disinformation. And I've done some research that earlier on, myself and a co-author argued that groups were like the entry point for disinformation, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. But something interesting has happened to me recently. So as we were talking about before the panel began, I have an 11-month-old, and I have found that Facebook groups in particular, because my parents and in-laws live farther away, have been one of my first stops when I have a question about my son, right? It has been such a place where I can kind of triage issues and find community with other new moms in the early days of motherhood. And so I think there's something there, right? A lot of times we find that conspiratorial thinkers are finding community in the places that they go to feed their conspiracy theories, whether that's QAnon message boards like 4chan, 8kun, et cetera, or other kind of radicalized spaces online. And that's where we have a lot of lessons learned from the countering violent extremism work that has been done over the past 10 to 15 years. That I think we can bring to bear in this discussion. It's not just about teaching people, how to tell a real image from a fake one or how to check their sources, right? It's about knowing the ways that they're being exploited online, not only by powerful people, but by powerful institutions, in these cases, the platforms. And I think that really, is resonant with what Nick was talking about before, and epistemic tribal communities and how they operate. There's a lot there that we can learn from the CVE space. And so thinking about how we create these communities and kind of scratch the itch that people have to connect with one another in a more fruitful, truth-based way is something that's really interesting to me, and something I've been thinking a lot about as we've seen Twitter devolve and become more akin to one of these extremist, more extreme online communities like, some of the message boards that I mentioned before, and how we can move to a place that is a little bit more productive, a little bit more respectful. I know there are former Twitter policy officials who are thinking about creating a Twitter-like platform that has trust and safety at its core. That platform is going to be called T2, I believe. And Sarah Oh, who is a former Twitter human rights official, is one of the main drivers behind that. But there's been a lot of conversation around things like Mastodon, the federated online community. And I have to say, some Mastodon servers are pretty respectful, others are not. And they've each got their own, sets of rules. Sometimes we see them taken farther than I think we'd like them to be, and other times we don't see enough enforcement. Similarly, Substack just launched Notes, which is a kind of Twitter-esque platform on the newsletter service. And I have a lot of mixed feelings about Substack. I've been a newsletterer for quite a long time and was an early adopter of Substack, and very publicly left the platform about a year and a half ago because I didn't believe that their kind of agnostic approach to content moderation was one that I wanted to support. They had a lot of disinformation, vaccine disinformation, et cetera, that they were actually monetizing. And I thought that was wrong. Then, Twitter killed Review, the service that I had moved my newsletter to. And so I had to move back to Substack. And now they've got a nascent social media platform on the website. But are we having a discussion? Right now, it's a pretty respectful place, but are we having a discussion about how they're going to do content moderation? No, we're not there yet, right? So I think we need to think about that psychological aspect. And part of any information literacy education needs to be about the ways that human beings are vulnerable, and how we can kind of take the bull by the horns and respond to that. I mean, just personally, yeah, I've got an Instagram problem. And I scroll every night, before I go to bed, and it's not a very good use of my time. But one of the things that I've done is I've turned off notifications for Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. I don't get those to my phone anymore. I know people who have changed their phone screens to grayscale to make it less enticing, setting up those sorts of parameters for yourself and understanding the ways that you are vulnerable to online manipulation, whether that's just by advertisers or otherwise, I think is really important. And that's part of the educational movement that we need to make as well.
Yeah, Thanks so much, Nina. In the interest of time, I know that you want to jump in as well, Nick, but let me just ask one other question, and then I want to hear from both of you, because I think it's really a nice question that might sort of bring together a lot of the themes that we've been exploring. This question asker here, it's Michael Glassman, is curious about the way in which we often seem to be talking about a golden age of information. And he asks whether or not that ever actually existed, right? There have been disinformation, misinformation campaigns and incidents in the past. And it seems, according to the question, that one of the dangers that the internet has helped us overcome is a reliance on gatekeepers who have an institutional stake in what people believe. So isn't it better if people understand, or move to understand, or begin to grapple with a kind of a joint responsibility for participating in an information community? So, for instance, we might think about moderation rules that are sort of communally constructed and enforced, right? But thinking about the ways in which this joint responsibility might impact the moderation and the information structure of these epistemic communities stands for this question asker as a hopeful possibility that's emerged through online contexts. Nick, let's start with you in response to this provocation. Then we'll hear from Nina.
Sure. Well, I certainly don't think that there was a golden age. I know at one point, New York City had something like 30 or 40 daily newspapers. And so if you want to talk about sort of epistemic niches, you could find the paper that would give you the news and information that coincided with your belief system. This is not a new thing. I do like the idea, I touched on it earlier briefly, that we need to rely more on communities and critical communities as a way of creating and enforcing internally some of the epistemic norms that we think are really important. I also think that there's a potential downside, and I won't belabor that as well. I do think we see some of that with the issue of conspiracy theories, and I wanted to come back to that point briefly. Nina had some great comments on that. I think conspiracy theories are a perfect example of where the individual believer or belief system is wrapped up with membership and participation in an epistemic group. We believe in a conspiracy, and the fact that we believe it is part of what binds us together within this group. And so it isn't just a bunch of individual believers. It gets its power from the fact that the conspiracy is shared widely. And that becomes, of course, among the people within that group, a confirmation that they're right and everybody else is wrong. This leads to the second point, which is another aspect of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theorists think that they're the critical thinkers. They think that they have, detected the evidence that everybody else has overlooked. They're not stupid. And as Nina said, in some cases, they're extremely intelligent. And sometimes I think more educated people are sometimes even more susceptible to these things, or can be even more susceptible to these things. But they don't think that they're dupes. They think that they're the critical thinkers and the rest of us are dupes. And the third thing I want to say is sometimes conspiracy theories are right. So we say the conspiracy theory that they faked the moon landing is ridiculous. But the conspiracy theory that the Russians did and are continuing to actively interfere with our elections is, in my opinion, true. And so whose conspiracy theories are fake and whose conspiracy theories are paranoid and whose conspiracy theories are supported by the fact is another one of the sort of meta questions that you're not going to settle simply by the dynamics within the group of people who believe them. Because in all cases, the group of people who believe them think that they're right and everybody else is wrong. I like these reminders because they're sobering that we're all susceptible to these things to some extent or another. And I want to close by echoing something else that Nina said. Part of the reason why we need to understand cognitive bias, confirmation bias, motivated reasoning is the more that we understand how our own psychologies work, the more we understand our own susceptibility to these things, A, we can become more resistant and self-monitoring through our own metacognition. And B, maybe we extend a little bit more understanding and tolerance to the people who believe the absolutely ridiculous, absurd things that we can't imagine that anybody believes, because they're motivated by some of the very same kind of psychological dynamics that we are, which goes back to an earlier point that it can't be as simple as saying we're right and they're wrong. Because I won't repeat myself again.
Thanks, Nick. Nina?
Yeah, wow, what an interesting discussion this has been. And I love that we ended with a provocative comment from one of the viewers. And I think, he's absolutely right. And I've encountered this a lot. I even got once in a congressional testimony, a congressman pushed back and said, there's been disinformation since the Trojan horse, which yes, there has been. But what we see with the internet is that information travels faster and farther and has much more of a radicalizing effect more quickly than it would in kind of the offline environment. And that's what's so worrisome about it. In terms of the question about gatekeepers, I think, as I said, I see instances in which online communities that are self-moderated have a really positive effect on people. And then I've also seen the flip side of that, where some of the most damaging, most radicalized, most violent information online is coming from communities that are self-moderated. In fact, you can point to January 6th as one of those instances, largely organized in things like Facebook groups and kind of private online communities. And we're seeing increasingly, as social media companies are stepping up to some degree, some of their content moderation, that these groups are moving toward less moderated fora like Telegram channels and private, WhatsApp app groups and things like that. And so we're seeing like the real kind of fragmentation of the internet. And I think when things are more open, more transparent, then those community content moderation principles absolutely work better, and there's more accountability. But when things are moving into kind of private spaces, it's when we see some really troublesome things. So again, I don't think that there is necessarily one solution, but I do think we need to think about the issues that are causing people to be vulnerable. Some of that is based on the infrastructure of the platforms. Some of it is based on a lack of responsive governance from our governments that are causing people to feel disenfranchised, that are causing people to seek community in places that make them quite vulnerable, right? And so it's a really difficult situation that we find ourselves in. I think, as I said at the beginning, to bring it back, not very much has changed in a positive direction over the past 7 or 8 years. And in fact, we're seeing more radicalizing behavior online. And I think that this is something that is not a partisan issue. It's affecting people from across the political spectrum. It's affecting people all up and down different income levels and across racial and ethnic divides. And it's something that at its core affects people's participation in democracy. If we don't have good information, we can't make informed choices at the ballot box. And I love this quote from Thomas Jefferson. I've ended a lot of presentations like this over the past 6 years. He says, if we think people not suitable, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, suitable enough to exercise a wholesome discretion, the answer is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion through education. And I think we've unpacked here a lot of issues today. We need to inform their discretion through education about how platforms work, about how we can be manipulated, and frankly about how to suss out good information from bad, and make the choice about whether or not to share that. And sometimes the question or the answer to that will be, just not to share. If we encounter a video and we're not sure if it's real or fake, we need to understand our role in the chain of custody of the information ecosystem, and let the buck stop with us and not share that information if we're not sure that it's real. Take care before you share, to use a trite little rhyming phrase there. But again, thank you, Winston, and OSU for organizing such a really fulsome discussion today.
Well, thank you, Nina, and thank you, Nick, and thanks to all of you who've been watching remotely. This has been such a rich conversation. As I said, I've got pages here of notes of things that I want to follow up on with students and colleagues, and hopefully looking forward to reading more work by our two panelists, as they have been terrific guides to navigating these sets of questions. As always, please, I encourage everyone to look forward to more events on the CEHV website, that is the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at OSU, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Take good care.